On December 6, 1941, as the icy wind of the North Pacific cut across the deck of the carrier Akagi, Lieutenant Zengi Abe stared into a fog so thick it felt like the world had ended. The cold stung his skin, but it wasn't the wind that made him tremble. Tucked inside his jacket, right above his heart, was a farewell letter to his wife and a lock of his own final gift for a funeral he expected not to attend. He had already written the words he hoped she'd never have to read. Asterisk, if I don't return, know that I served with honor. Asterisk. But beneath the calm exterior of a trained aviator, a sharp, unspoken fear gnawed at him. Were the Americans truly as fragile as his leaders in Tokyo claimed? In less than a day, he would get his ensign in the glory he was promised, but in a nightmare Japan never saw coming. You see, Japan didn't march toward Pearl Harbor with pride. It marched there because it was dying. In July 1941, President Roosevelt had frozen Japan's assets and hit them with a complete oil embargo. Britain and the Dutch East Indies followed suit. Overnight, Japan lost nearly 80% of its fuel, the very lifeblood of its empire. At best, their stockpiles could last 18 months. If a full-scale war broke out, that number dropped to less than a year. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto saw this disaster coming long before anyone else. He had lived in America, walked its crowded streets, and toured its factories that roared day and night. He understood a truth that no one in Tokyo wanted to hear. America was just a sleeping giant. It was an industrial superpower waiting for a reason to awaken. Early in 1941, Yamamoto wrote a bleak warning. To win, he argued, Japan would have to do more than just capture a few islands, or even Hawaii. They would have to march all the way to Washington itself and dictate terms of surrender in the White House. Anything less meant certain defeat. He doubted Japan's leaders truly grasped the scale of what they were proposing. But he was a soldier, and a soldier obeys. And so, he began crafting the very plan he knew could doom the nation he served. On November 26, 1941, Japan's first air fleet slipped out of Haito-Kapu Bay under a shroud of absolute secrecy. 6 aircraft carriers, Akagi, Kagaesa, Ri, Hiri, Shikaku, and Zuikaku, escorted by a massive fleet of warships and submarines. In total, 414 aircraft. For 2 agonizing weeks, they crossed the storm-torn North Pacific in complete radio silence, a route no American scout plane would ever think to patrol. At dawn on December 7th, they reached their strike position, just 230 miles north of Oahu. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida led the first, Wave 183. Aircraft lifting off the decks like steel arrows, aimed straight at the heart of history. For months, they had trained relentlessly over Kagoshima Bay, a location chosen specifically because it mirrored the shallow waters of Pearl Harbor. Japanese pilots had rehearsed dangerous torpedo runs just meters above the water, crashing again and again until they learned to skim the surface with deadly precision. Among them was a young pilot named Kanami Harada. Before leaving home, he had sent his pregnant wife away to her parents' house. He couldn't bear for her to see him depart, because in the Imperial Japanese Navy, tears were not permitted. At 7:40 a.m., Fuchida's formation descended upon Pearl Harbor. The harbor below was a perfect picture of peacetime, crowded with battleships, cruisers, and destroyers. Aircraft were parked neatly in rows, wingtip to wingtip exactly as Japan's spies had reported. But as Fuchida scanned the scene, his heart sank. Something was wrong. The American carriers, the Enterprise, the Lexington, and the Saratoga not there. Japan's true targets, the most valuable pieces on the board, had vanished. Fuchida hesitated for only a heartbeat before firing a blue flare into the dawn sky. Then, he radioed back 3 simple words that would echo for generations. Tora, Tora, Tora. Surprise attack achieved. What followed was 75 minutes of violence, unlike anything America had ever seen on its own soil. The battleship Arizona erupted in a single, cataclysmic blast, vaporizing over 1,000 men in an instant. The Oklahoma, mortally wounded, rolled onto her side like a dying beast, trapping hundreds of sailors inside. Planes burned where they sat on the airfields. Men jumped from their ships into an ocean of oily water that had itself caught fire. In the chaos, Japan lost only 29 planes. By every traditional military measure, it was a stunning, almost unbelievable triumph. But as the pilots circled over the inferno, that feeling of victory began to feel hollow. They saw what was still standing: the massive oil reservoirs, the critical repair docks, the submarine base, and the dry docks capable of reviving an entire fleet. And somewhere out on the vast Pacific, the American carriers were still out there, untouched and hunting. Lieutenant Zengiabe, flying with the second wave, dove his plane through a sky blackened with smoke. The smell of burning metal and fuel filled his cockpit. The harbor below was pure chaos, ships shattered, boaties floating, flames devouring steel. And yet, amid all that destruction, a terrible thought struck him. What if this wasn't the end? What if this was only the beginning? Back aboard the carrier Akagi, Commander Fukita frantically begged his superior, Vice Admiral Nagumo, to authorize a third strike. He pleaded with him to go back and destroy the fuel tanks and repair facilities. Nagumo refused. The element of surprise was gone, he argued. The carriers were too exposed. He ordered the entire fleet to withdraw. Tactically, it was a cautious, defensible decision. Strategically, it was catastrophic. Those fuel tanks and repair docks would soon bring Pearl Harbor roaring back to life, stronger, angrier, and absolutely unstoppable. On the long journey home, the Japanese pilots couldn't shake what they had witnessed. The sheer size of the American base, the countless ships, the massive infrastructure. If just one harbor held this much power, how much more lay hidden across the vast American continent? The answer arrived with crushing speed. In 1941, the year of the attack, Japan built just over 5,000 aircraft. By 1943, Japan managed to produce 16,000 planes in an entire year. America was producing that many every 2 months. Factories that once made automobiles were now forging bombers. At the Willow Run plant, a brand new Beta-4 Liberator rolled off the assembly line every 63 minutes. Shipyards were launching massive Liberty ships faster than Japan could possibly sink them. 3 new ships every 2 days. This wasn't a war, it was industrial suffocation. By 1944, the sky itself belonged to America. During the Battle of the Philippine Sea, 15 American carriers unleashed over 900 aircraft. Japan sent inexperienced boys in outdated planes into a blizzard of anti-aircraft fire. The massacre was so one-sided it earned a nickname as cruel as the battle itself: the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Somewhere between 350 and 600 Japanese aircraft were wiped out in a single day. One Japanese pilot wrote home in despair, "Where do these planes come from? We shoot them down, and the sky just fills up again." By 1945, Japan was broken. Its oil was gone. Its ships were gone. Its best pilots were gone. The nation was forced to turn young men into kamikazes, not as a tactic of choice, but because they had no fuel, no advanced weapons, and no options left. When the atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Japan was already bleeding to death, a victim of an enemy it could never, ever outbuild. During the war, America produced nearly 300,000 aircraft, over 2 million trucks, and tens of thousands of tanks and artillery pieces. Japan's total output barely scratched the surface of that. Admiral Yamamoto's grim prophecy had come true. 6 months of victory, followed by an unending cascade of defeat. He didn't live to see the end. His transport plane was shot down in 1943, after American codebreakers intercepted his travel plans and set a perfect trap. He died knowing the terrible truth that Japan had never stood a chance. Lieutenant Zengiabe survived the war, but what he saw that day at Pearl Harbor haunted him until his final breath. He and his comrades believed they were striking a soft, decadent nation. Instead, they had awakened a sleeping giant and filled him with a terrible resolve that would swallow Japan whole. Pearl Harbor was not Japan's triumph. It was the opening act of its own destruction. Because Japan didn't just challenge a navy, it challenged the greatest industrial force the world had ever seen. And that force buried Japan in steel, in fire, and in history. Thanks for watching. If you found this story compelling, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell for more deep dives into history. See you next time.